Assalamu alaikum. So welcome to part 2 of our Tafsir series of Surah Al-Baqarah. So today we're going to talk about the letters that occur at the beginning of certain surahs, which they call Al-Huruf Al-Muqatta'at, or the disjointed letters, which I prefer to think of them as like mysterious letters. So we're going to talk a little bit about them. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between the word Kitab and Qur'an, some of what we can see from that. And we're going to talk about the words dhalika, meaning that, and the words hadha, meaning this, and how that relates to the words Kitab and Qur'an. So let's begin. So beginning from the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, we find Surah Al-Baqarah starts with 3 of these letters that they call Al-Huruf Al-Muqatta'at, or the disjointed letters. Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika Al-Kitabu La Rayba Fih. So this is the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah. So the question is, what do these letters refer to? What meaning might these letters have? And there's a lot of different ideas out there. I just want to present one idea that to me makes sense when you put the verses together and helps us also to understand the difference between the word Kitab and the word Qur'an. And Allah knows best. It's one idea. There are other ideas, but it's just something for us to reflect on. So the first point is, if you think about this how this goes together, Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika al-Kitab. Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika al-Kitab, they usually translate as, some people translate it as, this is the book. But in actuality, the literal meaning of it, Dhalika al-Kitab, Dhalika is what they call Ismul Ishara lil Ba'id in Arabic, which means the noun that points to something far. So in Arabic, we have Asma'ul Ishara, we have nouns that point to something. So we have that, for example, Dhalika, or we have this, Hadha. So Hadha is Ismul Ishara lil Qarib, is the noun of pointing to something near. So when we say Hadha, something, we're saying this, it's near. But when we say Dhalika, it's Ismul Ishara lil Ba'id, it's pointing to something far. So we're saying that, like that over there. So the question that comes up in the interpretation of this verse is, why would Allah start off by saying Dhalika al-Kitab? That is the book. So that's why some people interpret this as meaning, or translate this as meaning, this is the book. But if we stick with the literal meaning, Dhalika, that is the book, it draws our attention perhaps to something else. What immediately preceded this were those letters, Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika al-Kitab, that is the book. So one way to look at this, perhaps, and Allah knows best, is that when it's referring to that is the book, it's saying those letters are the book, Dhalika al-Kitab. And what would that mean? So perhaps part of what that could mean is that those letters resemble a code that was given to the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad was given the ability to decode into the wording of the Qur'an that we have. So a good analogy, and I'm going to bring some other verses to support this idea, but a good analogy that I think can help us process this or understand this. If you think about how a computer communicates and how we communicate with computers, you can think of it as occurring on like 3 different levels. So the first level obviously is the binary level, the zeros and ones. This is the language of the computer. But when a computer programmer communicates with the computer, that person doesn't always use zeros and ones. They use a computer language, right, that allows them to interface with the computer. So they might learn C++ or a computer language like that. But us as average everyday users, we don't learn the zeros or ones, and we don't learn the computer language. So there's a user interface that makes it easier for us, that makes it user-friendly or accessible for the average everyday user, which allows us to maybe like click on an icon or use a keyboard or a mouse or something like that to communicate with the computer. So perhaps we can think of wahi, or the idea of communication through revelation, as like a similar process. Like there's a symbolic communication that takes place on the level of symbols and codes, and then the Prophet is able to communicate and to interface with this symbolic communication in a way that he can give us the Qur'an, which is like the interface, right, which is the icons and the things that we click on, that we can communicate with the bigger system. So that's one way to think about it. Dhalika al-Kitab, that is the book, the letters. So as a support for this idea, let's go to chapter 42, verse 1 through 3. So he says, Hamim, Ain, Sin, Qaf. So he mentions 5 of these letters in the beginning in verse 1 and 2. Ha, Mim, Ain, Sin, Qaf. And then in the very next verse, verse 3, he says, كَذَلِكَ يُوحِي إِلَيْكَ وَإِلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكَ اللَّهُ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. Like that. Okay, so they often translate this phrase, كَذَلِكَ, in English as likewise. But if you take it literally, ذَلِكَ means that. The kaf, the ka is for tashbih, like a comparison. كَذَلِكَ means like that, similar to that. يُوحِي إِلَيْكَ. He inspires to you. وَإِلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكَ. And to those before you. Allahul Azizul Hakim. Allah, the mighty and the wise. So it is like that Allah, the mighty and the wise, gives revelation and inspiration to you. It is like that. Like these letters. So when you put those two together, those two places in the Qur'an together, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ, and here, Ha Mim Ain Sin Qaf, كَذَلِكَ يُوحِي إِلَيْكَ. You get the feeling or impression that when he says, like that, he inspires to you, meaning symbolically in these symbols that then need to be decoded into the Qur'an. So, another point to talk about is that if we compare 2 verses in the Qur'an, we can see that perhaps the idea of wahi, or what we usually translate as revelation, has to do with symbolic communication. So if we go to chapter 3, verse 41, which is talking about Zechariah, and when Allah told him that he would not speak to people for 3 days and 3 nights, it says days in one place and nights in the other place. But if you compare how he was told to communicate in both places, so in one place he's told, أَلَّا تُكَلِّمَ النَّاسَ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ إِلَّا رَمْزًا, that you will not speak to people for 3 days, إِلَّا رَمْزًا, except through symbols, right? Except through symbols. And then if you go to chapter 19, and you see how this same idea with Zechariah is communicated there. So what it says there is, أَلَّا تُكَلِّمَ النَّاسَ ثَلَاثَ لَيَالٍ سَوِيَّةٍ, that you won't communicate, or you won't speak to people for 3 nights. But then how did he communicate? سَوِيَّة, I need to study and think about the meaning of that word. That's why I just summarized it to say 3 nights. فَخَرَجَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ مِنَ الْمِحْرَابِ, so he came out upon his people from the mihrab. فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ, and he gave them wahi. فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ, he gave them wahi. So in one place, he's told that you won't communicate with people إِلَّا رَمْزًا, except symbolically, through symbols. And in the other place, فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ, he did wahi to them, which we normally translate as inspiration or revelation. But if you put the 2 verses together, it seems like wahi then is symbolic communication. And so if you put it all together, then Alif Lam Mim, Ha Mim Ain Sin Qaf, all these letters are a symbolic code given to the Prophet that he's able and given the ability to decode. So that's where the Qur'an comes, because the Qur'an becomes the decoding of those symbols. So the Kitab is the coding, and the Qur'an is the decoding. So if you look at another place in the Qur'an, if you look in chapter 10, verse 37, so in chapter 10, verse 37, so this is really interesting, because if you compare this back to the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, he says, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, that is the book in which there is no raib, in which there is no doubt. And in probably our next installment of this series, we're going to talk about the difference between raib and shak, which are 2 words for doubt in the Quran. But for now, we'll take it as doubt. He says, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, that there is no doubt in it. So in another place in 1037, look how he describes the Quran. He says, وَمَا كَانَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنُ أَنْ يُفْتَرَى مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ, and this Quran was not such that it could be fabricated from other than Allah. وَلَكِنْ تَصْدِيقَ الَّذِي بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ, but rather it was a confirmation, or it is a confirmation of what's before it. وَتَفْصِيلَ الْكِتَابِ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ مِنْ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ, So he describes the Qur'an as Tafsil al-Kitab la rayba fihi, that it is a detailing. Actually, tafsil means literally to separate. So it's like something is joined together symbolically, because if you think of a symbol is a summary of an idea, like a picture or some kind of a symbolic representation of something. It kind of summarizes an idea in this symbol, and you can unpack it. You can unpack that symbol, right? So it's tafsil al-kitab. It is the detailed separation of the kitab la rayba fi, in which there is no doubt. So I think that's really interesting that in the beginning of the Quran he says ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, that this is the book, or I'm sorry, I did it. That is the book in which there is no doubt. And then when he talks about the Quran, he says the Quran is تَفْصِيلَ الْكِتَابِ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, that it's the detailing or the separation of the book in which there is no doubt. So that's something to think about when we put together the verses, to see perhaps some of what the difference is between Kitab and Qur'an, and also some of the meanings of al-huruf al-muqatta'at, or what they call the disjointed or the disconnected letters. So now this leads to the next thought about this. So when we look at, I mentioned dhalika is one of what we call asma'ul ishara, the nouns of pointing to something. And it's the noun, it's ismul ishara lil ba'id. Dhalika is the noun of pointing to something far. And the word hadha, which means this, is translated as this, is ismul ishara lil qarib. It's the noun of pointing to something near. So another very interesting observation in the Quran is that the word dhalika is associated with kitab, right? Dhalika al-kitab. And also so for example, if we look at verse 692, chapter 6, verse 92, the word hadha is also associated with kitab. Wa hadha kitabun, he says in 692, and this is a book. So when it comes to kitab, we find the word dhalika used, dhalika al-kitab, and we find the word hadha, wa hadha kitab. This is a book. However, when it comes to the Quran, we only find the word hadha used with it. We don't find dhalika al-Quran. That is the Quran. Hadha al-Quran. So we find, for example, in 2 verses where he says, Inna hadha al-Quran, truly this Quran. We're going to look at these verses real quick. But we find that 2 times, truly this Quran. And we find that in this verse, a similar thing, what I just read, وَمَا كَانَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ, and this Quran. So that's another thing I think that shows us the difference between Kitab and Quran, or one of the differences is Kitab can be expressed as something far or something near, but Quran can only be expressed as something near. So the Quran is something that is brought near to you in a user-friendly way. So the 2 verses that use the phrase Inna hadha al-Quran. So one verse says Inna hadha al-Quran yahdi lillati hiya aqwam, that truly this Quran guides to that which is most upright. And the other verse, which is chapter 27, verse 76, I actually want to read this whole verse because I want to compare this to another verse about Kitab. So 27:76, he says, Inna hadha al-Qur'ana yaqussu ala bani Isra'ila akthar alladhi hum fihi yakhtalifun. Truly this Qur'an narrates upon Bani Israel most of that which they differ about. Most of, akthar. Truly this Qur'an narrates upon Bani Israel most of that which they differ about. Okay? So, I already mentioned, 2 things. I already mentioned hadha al-Quran, which he says here, and you don't see dhalika al-Quran. You don't see that is the Quran in the Quran itself. But also, I think this verse leads us to another observation about the difference between Kitab and Quran. So notice in this verse, he says this Quran narrates upon Bani Israel most of, not all of. Now, if we compare that to another verse, chapter 16, verse 89. So chapter 16, verse 89, he says in this verse, وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. And we have sent down upon you the book as an explanation and a clarification of all things. So, comparing those two verses, in one verse he says the Qur'an narrates upon Bani Israel most of what they differ about. And in 1689 he says the book, he sent down upon you the book, which is a clarification or an explanation of all things. And in another verse he says, مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. We haven't left out or missed anything in the book. So when he talks about the book, the Kitab, he says we haven't left anything out. And it's a clarification of all things. When he talks about the Qur'an, he says it narrates most of what they differed. Why not all of? So perhaps this shows us an interesting distinction between Kitab and Qur'an. If Kitab, Allah knows best, represents a set of codes which explains all things, and the Qur'an is the decoding of that in certain language to make it user-friendly, then the comparison here perhaps tells us that the wording of the Qur'an itself doesn't tell us every single thing. Meaning, so for example, if we look at what does the Qur'an say about smoking, for example, we won't necessarily find a verse in the Qur'an that mentions exactly the word smoking, right? However, the Kitab will tell us something about that, because still within the language of the Qur'an, if we unpack its words and we unpack its sentences and we start to bring verses together and compare them, we can perhaps derive the coding that exists in the Kitab to tell us more information. And in that way, the Kitab becomes an explanation of everything. So the code itself explains everything. But the wording of the Qur'an is the user-friendly interface that we can access to try to dig deeper to access the code of the Kitab. So the Kitab, once we can dig deeper and find some of the meaning of the Kitab, it can explain everything for us. But not necessarily everything is going to be included in the wording of the Qur'an. That's perhaps one way to think about it. And what supports this is if we go to chapter 98, verse 2 and 3. So if we go to chapter 98, verse 2 and 3, he says, وَرَسُولٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ يَتْلُو صُحُفًا مُطَهَّرًا. A messenger from Allah reciting purified pages. فِيهَا كُتُبٌ قَيِّمَةٌ. In them are upright kutub. Now, when you read the translation of this verse, a lot of times they might say, in these pages are upright decrees. They might say upright laws. And they're translating the word kutub. And the word kutub is the plural of kitab. But if you just take it literally, he says, yatlu suhufan mutahhara. He's reciting pages that have been purified. Fiha kutubun. In the pages are books, are kitabs. So that's why sometimes they translate it as decrees or laws, because how are there books in the pages? You think of pages being in the books, you think of the opposite way. But if we rethink our idea of what is a kitab isn't necessarily, as we think of it, just a book. Perhaps a kitab is a set of codes or principles or laws about a particular topic. And by understanding and putting together all of the principles and laws about that particular topic, we have the kitab of that topic. And that gives us an understanding of how do we unlock the wisdom and the correct application and the correct understanding of that topic by understanding the kitab of that topic. All of the detailed laws and principles and coding related to that particular topic. So in that way, he's telling us in the pages that were given to the Messenger of Allah, fiha kutub, there are many different codings. There are many different codes that we can unlock to understand everything in life. And in that way, the kitab, the coding as a whole, becomes an explanation of everything that we can access through the user-friendly interface of the wording of the Qur'an. And Allah knows best. That's one way to think about Kitab, Qur'an, and the mysterious letters that begin the surahs. And I never try to say that the way that I explain it is the only possible way to explain it. Only Allah knows. Just sharing some reflections to get us thinking about it. And inshallah, hopefully you'll be here for part 3 when we talk about Raib and Shak, the different words for doubt in the Qur'an. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.